August 17, 1981. Brooklyn was very hot under a summer sun that felt heavy on the whole city. In a small apartment in Williamsburg, Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a powerful captain of the Bonano crime family, looked at himself in the mirror. Black shirt, black hair, black eyes that had seen a lot. Today, they would see something even darker. A single phone call had changed everything. A meeting normal for a mobster, or so it looked, but Sonny knew better. This was not business, this was judgment, his best friend. The young man he trusted, taught, and vouched for was an FBI agent. Donnie Brasco was not who he said he was, for Sonny Black. There was only one rule in a world built on violence: loyalty and blood. If you vouch for a rat, you die. No exceptions, no mercy, no second chances. In a few hours, he would walk into a room, knowing it was a trap, knowing it was the end. He would face his execution with the same honor he had asked from others all his life. Loyalty, respect, and the code, these were everything. And today, they would cost him everything. This is the story of Sonny Black. A rise through power, a fatal mistake, and a downfall planned by the very people he trusted most. A story of loyalty betrayed, of friendship broken, and of a man who died by the code he lived to follow. And it all starts in Brooklyn, where a boy named Dominick Napolitano first learned what it meant to survive and what it truly costs to belong. Before we look deep into the life and death of Sonny Black, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I love hearing from my global audience. Whether you are ending your night, starting your day, or relaxing, this story is for you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are building the best collection of gangster stories, true crime tales, and underworld legends. Give this video a like if you are ready for one of the most interesting mob stories ever told. Now let us go back to the 1930s in Brooklyn. He was 51 years old. A respected Captain Dominick Napolitano was born on June 16, 1930 in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York, into the Bonano crime family. Into a world where organized crime was not just a job choice. It was a way of life built into the neighborhood itself. Brooklyn in those days was a mix of ethnic neighborhoods, each with its own identity, its own culture, its own rules. The Italian neighborhoods: Bensonhurst, Williamsburg, Carroll Gardens, Red Hook, were areas controlled by the five families, the powerful crime groups that came from the chaos of Prohibition and grew strong during the Depression and World War II. For young Dominick, growing up in this place meant the mobsters were not distant, mythical people. They were neighbors. They ran the corner stores, operated the social clubs, controlled the unions that employed your father. They walked the streets in expensive suits, drove nice cars, commanded respect. When they entered a restaurant, people stood up. When they spoke, people listened. They had power, real power, in a world where most working-class Italian immigrants had none. The Bonano family controlled big areas in Brooklyn, named after Joseph "Joe Bananas" Bonano, one of the first bosses who helped create the Commission, the ruling group of the American Mafia in the early 1930s. The Bonanos were one of the five families that ruled organized crime in New York City. The others were the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Luccheses, and the Colombos. Each family had its own structure, its own areas, its own businesses. But they all followed the same basic code, the same rules made generations earlier. Young Dominick was smart, watchful, and ambitious. He watched and he learned. He learned that respect was everything, that a man's word was his bond, that loyalty to family, both blood family and the crime family, came before everything else. He learned that there were rules, ways of doing things, levels of power that had to be respected. He learned that violence, while sometimes needed, should be used wisely, not in anger. And he learned that in this world, there was no retirement plan. No pension, no peaceful old age you were in until death. Whether that came naturally or by a bullet, as a teenager and young man, Dominick began running errands for the neighborhood wise guys. Small things at first, delivering packages, carrying messages, keeping watch. This was how it always worked. The mob did not advertise for jobs or hold interviews. You grew up in the neighborhood. You showed you could be trusted. You proved you had potential. And slowly you were brought deeper into the life. Dominick proved himself reliable, quiet, and capable. He had the right attitude for the life. He was not a hothead, was not flashy or loud. He was calm, careful, the kind of guy who thought before he acted. But when action was needed, he did not hesitate. That mix, thoughtfulness paired with the willingness to do violence, was exactly what the family looked for. Records and reports show Napolitano became a made man after years as an associate. Available sources say he became made before the late 1970s, but an exact public year is not firmly in open records. Having gone through the traditional initiation ceremony that had been done for generations, the ceremony was always the same. The new member would be brought to a secret place, usually a private home or the back room of a social club. The room would be filled with made members of the family, including captains, and sometimes even the boss himself. The new member would stand before them, and the rules would be explained. This thing of ours, La Cosa Nostra, came before everything. Before your wife, before your children, before your own life. If the family called, you came. If the family ordered, you obeyed. If the family demanded your life, you gave it without question. There were other rules, too. Never speak about the organization to outsiders. Never raise your hand against another made member without permission. Never want another member's wife. Never get involved in drugs. Though this last rule had been ignored more and more by the 1970s as the possible profits were too tempting. Traditional initiation rites involve symbolic acts like a drop of blood on a saint card and spoken oaths meant to bind new members to La Cosa Nostra. While such ceremonies are widely reported and described by law enforcement and first-hand stories, exact rituals could vary by crew and time. Sources describe Napolitano as a man who strongly respected the Mafia code, including omerta. The oath he took that day became the guiding rule of his life. From that moment forward, he was Bonano family. And being Bonano meant everything. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Dominick, now more known by his street name, Sonny Black, learned the various businesses that kept the family profitable. Organized crime in New York was a varied business, much more complex than the simple idea of gangsters robbing banks or running gambling joints. It was loan sharking, where the family would lend money at very high interest rates to people who could not get regular loans. If they could not pay, well, there were ways of collecting. Broken bones were just the start. Sometimes businesses were taken over. Sometimes things were seized. Sometimes examples were made. Sonny learned to judge risk, to decide who was a good person for a loan and who was too likely to not pay, to balance the profit chance against the cost of making them pay. There was extortion and protection rackets. Business owners in family territory would be approached and offered protection from robberies, vandalism, fires, and other bad things that might happen to an unprotected business. The meaning was clear. The protection was often from the family itself. For a regular monthly payment, your business would be safe. Refuse to pay and problems would start. Broken windows, suppliers who strangely could not deliver, customers who were scared away. And finally, if you were very stubborn, a fire or a beating. Sonny collected from various businesses in his area, always professional, always polite, but with a feeling of threat that made refusal unthinkable. There was labor racketeering. The mob had deep ties to various unions, the Teamsters, the longshoremen, the construction unions. They controlled who got jobs, who got contracts, who got access to the waterfront, Companies that wanted labor peace paid the family. Companies that did not experience strikes, slowdowns, sabotage. Sonny had connections to the unions at the docks where cargo containers gave endless chances for theft and hijacking. Speaking of hijacking, that was another big money source. Trucks carrying everything from cigarettes to designer clothes to electronics would be found, followed and taken, sometimes with the help of the driver, who would be paid off and told to report the hijacking to police. Sometimes through threats or violence, the goods would be sold through various networks, sold for a part of the retail price, but still at huge profit to the family. Sonny became especially good at finding valuable cargo and planning efficient hijackings. There was also gambling, numbers running, bookmaking, illegal casinos. The Bonano family ran many gambling operations throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan. Sonny collected the money, managed the runners, dealt with problems, and made sure the weekly take went up the chain to the captains and finally to the leaders. And then there were drugs, despite the official rule against drug trafficking. A rule made by the old bosses who saw drugs as bringing too much police attention. Many mobsters could not resist the huge profits available in heroin and cocaine dealing. The rule was ignored more than followed, with made members either dealing directly or taking a cut from dealers working in their area. Sonny, like most mobsters of his time, looked the other way or got involved himself when the money was too good to pass up. Through all of this, Sonny built a reputation. He was known as a solid earner, someone who brought in steady money for the family. He was known as a good boss to his crew, fair but demanding, willing to help his guys, but expecting total loyalty and work in return. He was known as someone who could handle problems, whether that meant settling a fight, scaring a reluctant debtor, or when needed, planning violence. But maybe most importantly, Sonny built a reputation as a man of honor. Someone who lived by the old code in a world where betrayal could come at any moment, where today's friend might be tomorrow's informant, where being suspicious was right and trust was more valuable than cash. Sonny Black was seen as someone who could be trusted. He kept his word. He honored his promises. He did not talk to law enforcement. He did not cooperate. He would rather go to prison, and he did, serving several times throughout his career, than break omerta. The code of silence, this reputation would help him as he moved up the ranks. It would also finally be his downfall. By the mid-1970s, Sonny Black had become a capo, a captain in the Bonano family. This was an important position, one that gave real power and responsibility. The structure of a mafia family was clear. At the top was the boss, the head of the family who made final decisions on big issues and represented the family on the commission. The council of bosses from the 5 families. Below the boss was the underboss, his second in command. There was also a consigliere, a counselor or advisor, often an older experienced member who gave advice. Below this leadership were the captains or capos. Each captain ran his own crew, a group of made members and associates who worked in a certain area or specialized in certain crimes. The captain was responsible for his crew's earnings, for keeping order, for settling fights, and for making sure the weekly payment went up to the leaders. As a captain, Sonny Black ran his operations from a social club in Brooklyn. These social clubs were a special part of mob life, real storefronts that worked as headquarters for family business. They were called social clubs because on paper, they were just that. Private clubs where members could gather to play cards, drink coffee, watch television, and talk. In reality, they were command centers. Sonny's club became his second home. This was where his crew would gather every day. This was where they would discuss operations, divide up money, settle fights, and get instructions. The club had a back room where private talks could happen, where secret business could be discussed away from watching eyes and ears. There was always coffee brewing, always a card game going, always the television playing in the background, often a ball game or a movie. The feeling in these clubs was special. There was a certain routine to the daily schedule. Made members would arrive at a certain time each day, showing respect to their captain and their fellow members. They would kiss each other on the cheek in greeting, not out of love necessarily, but as a sign of respect and brotherhood. They would sit and talk, often in a careful, coded language that mobsters had perfected over decades of police watching. Talks were careful. You never knew who might be listening, who might have turned, who might be wearing a wire. So business was discussed in hints and indirect references. That thing we talked about could mean a murder. Taking care of that problem might refer to an extortion. Names were often replaced with nicknames or vague references. Details were avoided when possible, but within this feeling of worry and caution, there was also real friendship. These were men who had grown up together, who had committed crimes together, who had gone to prison together, who had proven their loyalty to each other over years or even decades. They celebrated together, weddings, christenings, holidays. They were sad together when one of their own was killed or imprisoned. They were brothers in a real way, bound together by blood oaths and shared secrets that would mean prison or death if told. Sonny Black was very much a part of this culture. He held court in his club, receiving visitors, hearing requests, making decisions. His crew looked up to him. When he spoke, they listened. When he gave an order, it was followed. But Sonny was not a bully. He was reachable, approachable. He would sit and have coffee with anyone. He would listen to problems. He would help out when he could. This mix, authority mixed with approachability, made him respected and even liked within his crew and the wider Bonano family. His personal style showed old-school mob values. He dressed well, but not flashily, usually in dark, plain clothing. Always neat and clean. He was soft-spoken, rarely raising his voice. He did not use drugs or drink too much. He was careful with money, living comfortably, but not showing off. He kept relationships with his family, even as he kept them separate from his criminal life as much as possible. In the ranks of the Bonano family in the 1970s, Sonny Black was in a good position. He was a respected captain with a productive crew. He had relationships with other captains and with members of the leadership. He understood the politics of the family, the friendships and rivalries, the wants and anxiety that drove men to murder and betrayal. He had survived internal wars, avoided prosecution on major charges, and built a reputation that commanded respect. He seemed sure to keep rising. Perhaps he would become an underboss someday, or even a boss. The future looked bright for Sonny Black. But the future has a way of surprising even the most careful planners. And forces were already moving that would bring down not just Sonny Black, but the whole structure he had spent his life building. To understand what happened to Sonny Black, you need to understand the Bonano family in the 1970s. Because the family was going through a time of great trouble and violence that would create the conditions for both Sonny's rise and his fall. The Bonano family had a complicated history. Joseph Bonano, the founder and namesake, had been one of the first commission members, one of the young leaders who had modernized the American Mafia in the early 1930s. But by the 1960s, Bonano had become ambitious, maybe too ambitious. He allegedly planned to kill other commission members and take over their areas. The plan was discovered, and the commission demanded his retirement. Bonano refused, and the result was the Bonano War, a bloody internal fight that lasted from 1964 to 1968 and left many dead on both sides. Finally, Bonano was forced into retirement and new leadership took over the family. But the damage was done. The Bonano family's reputation was hurt. They lost their seat on the commission for a while. Other families looked at them with suspicion and dislike. Internal division stayed through the 1970s. The family struggled to get back on its feet. The boss during much of this time was Philip "Rusty" Rastelli. But he spent a lot of time in prison, which created a power vacuum. A chance for ambitious captains to make moves. One of those ambitious captains was Carmine Galante. Galante was old school, a traditionalist who had been a major figure in the family for decades. He had served serious prison time, over 10 years in federal prison for drug trafficking, and came out in the mid-1970s hungry for power. While Rastelli was in prison, Galante basically took control of the family, acting as boss without official okay from the commission. Galante was ruthless and paranoid, even by mafia standards. He got rid of rivals and took power. He expanded the family's drug operations, bringing in huge profits, but also huge police attention. He made other families angry with his pride and taking of new areas. He surrounded himself with a crew of Sicilian gangsters, nicknamed the Zips because of their fast Italian speech, whom he trusted more than American-born mobsters. For captains like Sonny Black, this time was dangerous. You had to carefully move between official loyalty to the imprisoned Rastelli and practical cooperation with the powerful Galante. A wrong move could be deadly. Friendships had to be carefully managed. Information had to be carefully controlled. Survival needed political skill as much as criminal ability. The tension came to a head on July 12, 1979. Galante was having lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, one of his regular spots. It was a hot summer afternoon. Galante was sitting in the back patio area, enjoying his meal, a cigar in his teeth as always. With him were his bodyguards and friends. At about 2:45 p.m., 3 masked gunmen entered the restaurant. They went straight to the patio. What happened next was quick and brutal. The gunmen opened fire with shotguns and handguns at close range. Galante was hit many times, killed instantly. His cigar stayed in his teeth, even in death, making one of the most famous crime scene photos in Mafia history. His bodyguard was also killed. The other men with him, suspiciously, were not. The hit on Carmine Galante was approved by the Mafia Commission because his unchecked drug operations and open disrespect of the Commission threatened the stability of all 5 families. The killing took place on July 12, 1979, at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Bushwick. Law enforcement sources later decided the Commission approved the operation, and Bonano, members loyal to imprisoned boss Philip "Rusty" Rastelli, helped do it. After Galante's death, Rastelli remained the official boss from prison, but the family split. Some captains wanted more influence for themselves, while others promised loyalty to Rastelli. Among those later involved in the power struggle were Alphonse "Sonny Red" Indelicato, Dominick "Big Trin" Trinchera, and Philip "Philly Lucky" Giacone, whose own try to take power would end violently in 1981. Sonny Black found himself in the middle of this power struggle. He had survived the Galante time by being careful, by not taking too strong a side one way or another, by focusing on his own crew and operations rather than getting too involved in family politics. But now, with everything uncertain, he would have to make choices that would decide his future. The stage was set for another round of bloodshed, another internal war that would change the Bonanno family, and into this unstable, dangerous situation walked a young man named Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief and hustler who was looking to make connections in the mob. Except Donnie Brasco was not what he seemed. Not even close. Joseph Pistone was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1939. The son of Sicilian-American parents, unlike Sonny Black, Pistone had not grown up surrounded by organized crime. He had a fairly normal upbringing. He went to college and after a short time in the Navy, joined the FBI in 1969. Pistone was assigned to the FBI's New York office and began working on various cases. He proved himself capable, dedicated, and especially good at undercover work. He had the right look, Italian-American from a working-class background. Comfortable in that culture, he could talk the talk, walk the walk. He understood the manners, the attitudes, the worldview of the men he would be investigating in the mid-1970s. The FBI was looking to expand its reach into organized crime. The Bureau had had success using informants-made members who, facing long prison sentences or other pressures, agreed to work with law enforcement, but informants had limits. They could give information about their own crew, maybe about their family, but they were always limited by their place in the ranks and by the paranoia of other mobsters who might suspect them. What the FBI wanted was to actually get an agent inside the mob, not as an informant turning after the fact, but as a real member. Someone who could see operations firsthand, who could record crimes, who could work his way up the organization and possibly give evidence against high-ranking members. It was an ambitious idea, maybe even a crazy one. The Mafia had survived for decades exactly because of their secrecy, their suspicion of outsiders, their careful checking processes, but the FBI decided to try. And the agent they chose for this new operation was Joe Pistone. He would need a new identity, a full background story, a character that could stand up to intense checking by some of the most suspicious, paranoid criminals in America. That character would be Donnie Brasco. The cover story was carefully built. Donnie Brasco was a jewel thief and burglar originally from California who had moved to New York looking for chances. He had a criminal record made by the FBI that would check out if anyone looked into it. He knew about jewelry, could judge gems and precious metals, could talk smartly about selling stolen goods. He dressed well, but not too well. Nice clothes, some gold jewelry. The look of a successful hustler. He was confident but not proud, ambitious but not pushy, knowledgeable but willing to learn. The character was designed to be attractive to mobsters. The Mafia was always looking for good earners, for guys who could bring in money and who were not afraid to break the law. A skilled jewel thief with West Coast connections who was looking to work with an organization. That was exactly the kind of person the mob wanted to recruit. In 1976, Pistone, now fully being Donnie Brasco, began going to places where mobsters hung out. He was introduced around by FBI connections, building a reputation as a capable thief and hustler. He was careful, patient, not pushing too hard, letting relationships grow naturally. His first big mob contact was Anthony Mira, a Bonanno family soldier. Mira was a particularly violent and unstable mobster known for his quick temper and brutal methods. He was not an ideal contact in many ways, but he was connected and he was looking to bring capable earners into his circle. Mira introduced Donnie Brasco around, vouching for him in a limited way, bringing him to social clubs and letting him meet other members of the Bonanno family. For Pistone, this was progress, the first step into the world he was trying to get into. But Mira was unpredictable and dangerous, and their relationship stayed somewhat surface. Then in 1977, Donnie Brasco met Benjamin "Lefty Guns" Ruggiero, and everything changed. Benjamin Ruggiero, known through the mob as Lefty Guns, or just Lefty, was a soldier in the Bonanno family, a made member who had been in the life for decades. Lefty was in his early 50s when he met Donnie Brasco, a veteran mobster who had seen and done it all. He had done robberies, burglaries, extortions, attacks, and almost certainly murders. Though he was never successfully charged for murder, Lefty was also, by mob standards, not very successful. Despite decades in the life, he was still just a soldier, not a captain. He was always struggling for money, always trying to come up with new plans and hustles to make ends meet. He was a compulsive gambler, and his betting losses often ate up whatever he did manage to earn. He lived simply, drove old cars, wore suits that were clean, but not expensive. But Lefty knew the life inside and out. He understood how the mob worked, how the ranks functioned, how business was done, what the rules were, and when they could be bent. He had been around long enough to have stories about legendary mobsters, about famous hits, about the old days when the families were at their peak. He was a keeper of mafia culture and tradition. When Lefty met Donnie Brasco, he saw potential. Here was a young guy, mid-30s, smart, capable, a good earner who knew about jewels and hijacking and various criminal businesses. More importantly, Donnie showed respect. He listened to Lefty's experience. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He understood the ways of doing things, or at least seemed to learn them quickly. He did not overstep, did not try to be something he was not. For Donnie, for Pistone, Lefty was exactly what he needed. Here was a made member willing to take him under his wing, to teach him, to bring him deeper into the organization. The relationship that grew was in its way real. Pistone would later write about how he came to have real affection for Lefty, even as he was gathering evidence that would finally send Lefty to prison. They began spending time together every day. Lefty would pick up Donnie in the morning, and they would spend the whole day together, going to the social club, meeting with other mobsters, talking about potential jobs, actually committing crimes. They would have lunch together, dinner together. Lefty would take Donnie to family events. They would talk about their lives, their hopes, their frustrations. Lefty became Donnie's teacher, teaching him the details of mob life. He explained the ranks, who was made, who was just an associate, who was connected to who had power, and who was just pretending. He taught Donnie the rules: never lie to a made member, never disrespect a made member's family, always show proper respect to your bosses, never discuss family business with outsiders. He taught Donnie how to act, how to dress nice but not flashy, clean and presentable but not drawing attention, how to speak careful, indirect, never saying anything directly that could be recorded or testified to later, how to behave in the social club, who to greet first, how to show respect, when to speak and when to stay quiet. Most importantly, Lefty vouched for Donnie in the mafia. Vouching for someone was a serious matter. It meant you were putting your reputation, possibly even your life, on the line for this person. If they turned out to be trouble, a thief stealing from the family, a loudmouth bringing police heat, or worst of all, a rat, you were responsible. The punishment could be severe, even deadly, but Lefty believed in Donnie. He saw him as a capable earner who could help Lefty finally get the financial success that had escaped him for so long. He also saw him as a sort of replacement son. Lefty's own son had rejected him. Wanting nothing to do with his father's criminal life, Donnie filled that empty space. And Lefty became emotionally invested in their relationship in a way that went beyond simple criminal connection. Through Lefty, Donnie met more and more members of the Bonano family. He was brought to various social clubs. He met captains and soldiers. He took part in criminal activities, always careful to let the FBI know what was happening, always trying to record everything without breaking his cover. One of the captains Donnie met through Lefty was Dominick Sonny Black Napolitano. The relationship between Sonny Black, Lefty Ruggiero, and Donnie Brasco became one of the central parts of the Bonano family in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Sonny, as a captain, was higher than Lefty, who was a soldier normally. This might have meant a formal, somewhat distant relationship, but Sonny and Lefty had history together, had known each other for years, had committed crimes together, and survived together. When Lefty brought Donnie around, Sonny paid attention. As a captain, Sonny was always looking for good earners for his crew. Donnie Brasco seemed to be exactly that. A skilled criminal with knowledge in areas that could be profitable for the family. More than that, Donnie seemed to be the right kind of guy, respectful, quiet, capable of violence when needed, but not a hothead. Sonny began including Donnie in more activities. Hijackings were planned with Donnie's input. Jobs were organized with him as a part. Money was made and shared. The relationship grew from simple criminal connection to something close to real friendship. For Pistone, This was both a huge success for the operation and an increasingly complicated personal situation. He was getting exactly what the FBI wanted: deep access to the Bonano family. Direct watching of criminal activity, relationships with made members and captains. He was recording crimes, gathering evidence, building a case that would finally bring down many mobsters. But he was also unavoidably becoming personally involved with these men. He would later describe the complexity of his feelings, how he had real affection for Lefty, even as he was betraying him, how he respected Sonny's intelligence and leadership, even as he was gathering evidence against him, how he felt like he was living a double life that was increasingly hard to manage. The daily routine became all-consuming. Pistone would wake up as Donnie Brasco. He would meet with Lefty, and they would spend the day together. He would go to the social club, sit around with made members and associates, discuss crimes, plan jobs. He would have dinner with these men and their families. He would celebrate with them, share troubles with them, live among them. At night, when he could get away, he would meet with his FBI handlers and tell them what he had learned. He would wear a wire when possible. Though this was very dangerous, if caught, he would be killed immediately. He would give details about criminal activities, about family politics, about who was planning what. Then he would go home to his real home with his real wife and family, who were living under great stress from his undercover work, and try to keep some connection to his real identity as Joseph Pistone. FBI agent. The strain was huge. Undercover work of this depth and length was new. Most undercover operations lasted weeks or months, not years. Pistone was living as Donnie Brasco, basically full-time for years on end. The mental toll was big. He was lying to everyone, constantly keeping a false identity, always at risk of being found out and violently killed. But the operation was producing results. The FBI was getting new access to the inner workings of a mafia family. They were recording crimes as they happened. They were understanding the structure, the relationships, the operations in a way that had never been possible before. And Donnie Brasco was getting closer and closer to being made, to becoming an actual member of the Bonano family, if that happened. It would be a historic moment, an FBI agent brought into the mafia. The evidence he could gather as a made member would be amazing. Sonny Black began to see Donnie as more than just a capable earner. He saw potential for something more. Sonny was ambitious, always looking to strengthen his position in the family. Having a capable, intelligent, loyal member in his crew who could handle important tasks was valuable. Sonny began to trust Donnie with more sensitive matters, bringing him deeper into the inner circle. They would sit together in the back room of the club talking strategy and business. Sonny would explain the politics of the family, who was friends with whom, where the threats and chances were. He would ask Donnie's opinion on various matters. Valuing his view, they would discuss potential jobs, judge risks and rewards, plan operations. Outside of business, they would sometimes have dinner together, just talking. Sonny would tell stories about the old days, about legendary mobsters he had known, about how the life had changed over the decades. Donnie would listen, taking in everything, filing it away for his FBI reports, but also really interested in the talk. There was a moment that Pistone would later tell in his book and in interviews, a moment that caught the strange double nature of his situation. They were sitting in a restaurant, and Sonny said something like, "You know, Donnie, I trust you. You are like a brother to me." And Pistone felt a real pang of guilt and sadness, because he knew what was coming, knew that this trust was completely wrong, knew that he was going to destroy this man's life. But the operation continued. That was the job. That was what being an FBI agent meant. Personal feelings, however real, could not get in the way of the mission. And the mission was to get inside and finally take apart the Bonano family. Sonny Black's headquarters was a place called the Motion Lounge in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. This was not just another social club. It was the nerve center of Sonny's operations, the place where his crew gathered daily, where business was done, where the life of a Bonano captain happened. The Motion Lounge had a specific feeling. Like all mob social clubs, from the outside it was plain. Just another storefront on a Brooklyn street. But inside it was a world of its own. There was the main room with tables and chairs, a bar, a television, usually playing sports or old movies. The walls might have photos or paintings, maybe a calendar from a local business. Perhaps a picture of a saint or the Virgin Mary. But it was the people who gave the place its character. Every day, members of Sonny's crew would arrive. There was a routine to it. You would enter, and if there were made members present, especially the captain, you would greet them properly, a kiss on the cheek, a sign of respect. You would ask about their health, their family. Then you would find a seat, order a coffee or a drink, and settle in. The talk would flow around various topics. Sports were always popular. These were passionate fans who would bet on games and follow their teams closely. Current events would be discussed, though always through the lens of how it might affect their operations. Family matters would be shared: whose daughter was getting married, whose son was going to college, whose cousin was having problems. But mixed with all of this was business, always business. It might be discussed indirectly in careful language designed to be vague if overheard. That thing with the trucks. How is that coming? We need to have a conversation with that guy who has been late. There is an opportunity we should discuss later. Those who knew understood what was really being said. Outsiders would hear only pieces and hints. The back room was where the serious talks happened. This was where Sonny would hold court, where problems were brought to him for solving, or where strategy was planned. If there was a fight between members of the crew, they would go to the back room with Sonny and make their cases. If there was a big job being planned, the key people would gather in the back room to work out details. If there was trouble, police interest, problems with other crews or families, internal issues, the back room was where it would be dealt with. Donnie Brasco became a regular at the Motion Lounge. He would arrive each day, go through the routines, sit and talk with the other members of the crew. He would take part in the discussions, offer ideas, help plan operations, and all the while he was watching, remembering, recording. The FBI wanted specific evidence of specific crimes. They wanted to be able to prove in court that these men were in criminal conspiracy, that they were doing extortion, hijacking, murder. Pistone was gathering that evidence day by day, conversation by conversation. But he was also gaining something more valuable in some ways, a deep understanding of how the Mafia actually worked. Not the Hollywood version, not the myth, but the reality, how decisions were made, how fights were settled, how money flowed up and down the ranks, how violence was approved and carried out, how the code of omerta was enforced. He learned that the mob was in many ways like any other organization. There were office politics, personality clashes, ambitious people moving for advancement, Angers overseen slights or unfair treatment. But it was also basically different because the stakes were so much higher. An office fight in a regular company might result in someone losing their job. In the mob, it might result in them losing their life. He learned about the money side of organized crime. The family worked like a company in many ways. There was a ranks with money flowing upward. Soldiers would earn from their criminal activities, but they owed a percentage to their captain. The captain would earn from his crew and his own operations, but he owed payment to the leaders, the boss, underboss, and consigliere. Everyone got a cut. Everyone paid up the chain. But unlike a regular company, there were no contracts, no legal way to fix things if someone did not pay what they owed or if someone was treated unfairly. Everything was based on respect, fear, and the unspoken threat of violence. If you earned well and paid your payment, you were valued. If you failed to earn or failed to pay up, you became a problem, and problems were dealt with harshly. He learned about the paranoia that filled mob life. Everyone was always worried about informants, about undercover agents, about surveillance. Conversations were carefully coded. Meetings were held in places that were checked for bugs. People were constantly judged for their loyalty. A wrong word, a suspicious action, an unexplained absence could lead to intense checking and possibly deadly conclusions. The irony, of course, was that their paranoia was completely right. There was an undercover agent among them. He was gathering evidence daily. Their fears were well-founded, but because Donnie Brasco had been so carefully made, because Pistone was so skilled at his role, because Lefty's vouching was so complete, the suspicions never focused on him. At least not yet. As Donnie Brasco became more deeply part of Sonny Black's crew, he took part in many criminal activities. This was needed to keep his cover. He could not just watch. He had to actually be a criminal alongside the other members of the crew. The FBI had given him permission to commit certain crimes to further the operation. Though there were limits to what was allowed, hijackings were a regular activity. The crew would get information about valuable cargo. Maybe electronics, maybe designer clothing, maybe cigarettes or liquor. They would find the truck, plan the stop, and do the theft. Sometimes this involved help from the driver, who would be paid off to look the other way or to give information about routes and timing. Sometimes it involved actually stopping the truck through threats or force and taking the cargo. Donnie took part in these hijackings, helping to plan them and sometimes doing them. The FBI would know in advance, and they would allow the hijacking to happen to keep Donnie's cover, though they would often arrange to get the goods back later. From the crew's view, Donnie was a valuable part who knew how to judge goods, how to sell stolen property, how to lower risk. There was also gambling. The crew ran various illegal gambling operations, bookmaking, numbers running, illegal card games. Donnie helped collect money, manage runners, deal with problems. He learned the details of the gambling business, how odds were set, how bets were tracked, how winnings were paid out, and how debts were collected. Debt collection was its own specialty. When someone owed money to a loan shark and was not paying, someone had to go collect. This could be as simple as a talk, a reminder that payment was expected, but it could also get worse quickly. If the debtor kept refusing payment or said they could not pay, the methods would become more aggressive. Threats, intimidation, damage to property, physical violence, broken bones, occasionally murder. Donnie saw and took part in some of this collection activity. He saw how easily violence could be used, how a friendly talk could turn threatening in seconds, how men who seemed nice and happy could become completely ruthless when their money was at stake. He also learned about the extortion rackets. Businesses throughout Sonny's area paid protection money to the crew. Donnie would sometimes go with other crew members to collect these payments. The business owners knew the routine, a monthly payment, always in cash, handed over without complaint. Some of these owners probably thought they were getting something for their money, some amount of actual protection. Others understood it was simply extortion, but paid anyway because the results of refusal were too bad. Once in a while, a business owner would refuse to pay or would fall behind. When this happened, the crew had to respond both to collect the money and to send a message to other business owners that not paying had results. Windows would be broken, stock would be damaged or stolen. The owner might be beaten. In extreme cases, the business might be burned down. Donnie recorded all of this. When he could, he wore a wire, recording talks that clearly discussed criminal activities. When he could not wear a wire, he would write detailed reports for his FBI handlers, describing what had been discussed, what crimes had been committed, who had taken part. He was building a massive case, crime by crime, conversation by conversation. But he was also unavoidably crossing ethical lines. Yes, he had FBI permission for his part in these crimes. Yes, it was needed to keep his cover. Yes. The final goal, bringing down the Bonano family, made the methods okay. But he was still taking part in actual crimes that hurt actual victims. Business owners who paid protection money were real people losing real income. Truck drivers who were scared during hijackings felt real fear. Debtors who were threatened or beaten suffered real harm. Pistone dealt with this in his own way. He told himself that he was preventing worse crimes by being there. that his information was allowing the FBI to stop major criminal plans, that the short-term ethical compromises were worth the long-term good of taking apart organized crime. Whether this reasoning was enough is a question he would have to answer for himself. What is sure is that the operation was producing amazing results. The FBI was gaining new understanding of mafia operations. They were recording criminal plans involving dozens of made members and associates. They were understanding the structure and function of the Bonano family in detail that had never before been possible. And Donnie Brasco was getting closer and closer to the final achievement, being suggested for membership in the family. In the mafia, being made, becoming a full member of a crime family, was the final achievement. Only made members could take part in family decisions, could vote on important matters, could hold positions like captain or boss. Made members were protected by the rules of the organization. Killing a made member without commission approval was reason for execution. Made members were trusted with the family's deepest secrets, were allowed to know the most sensitive information, but getting made was not easy. There were strict needs. You had to be Italian, or at least half Italian on your father's side. You had to be sponsored by a made member who would vouch for you. You had to have proven yourself through years of criminal activity, showing your earning ability, your willingness to do violence, your following of the code of Omerta, and you had to be willing to kill for the family. In fact, many families required that you actually commit a murder as part of the start process. Donnie Brasco met most of these needs, at least on the surface. His cover story said Italian heritage. He had proven himself as an earner, taking part in many profitable criminal activities. He had been around for years, now since 1976, and it was now the early 1980s. He had shown loyalty, quietness, and capability. Lefty Ruggiero had been talking about suggesting Donnie for membership. Sonny Black, as captain, would have to approve the suggestion and could possibly sponsor Donnie himself. The talks were happening. The wheels were turning. If it went through, Donnie Brasco would become the first FBI agent ever made into the mafia. For the FBI, this was both incredibly exciting and deeply troubling. The information value of having a made member as an undercover agent would be huge. But there were serious issues to think about. The start ceremony would likely involve criminal activity, possibly including murder. Could the FBI allow Pistone to commit murder to keep his cover? Obviously not. So how would they handle that? There was also the question of how long the operation could continue. It was already new in length, over 5 years by this point. Pistone was under huge mental strain. His marriage was suffering. His real identity was becoming lost in his cover identity. The FBI had to balance the value of continued information gathering against the very real costs to their agent. And there were operational worries. The longer Pistone was undercover, the bigger the risk of being found out. A single mistake, a single moment of carelessness, a single piece of bad luck, and he would be discovered. And if he was discovered, he would be killed immediately and brutally. The mob did not put traitors on trial. They executed them, but for now the operation continued. Donnie Brasco was deeply inside the Bonano family, trusted by Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black, taking part in daily criminal activities, and possibly on the edge of becoming a made member. The FBI had never achieved anything like this before. Meanwhile, inside the Bonano family, the political situation was becoming more and more unstable. The murder of Carmine Galante had solved one problem, but created others. The group that had organized the hit expected to be rewarded with power and position. But Philip Rastelli, the official boss who had been in prison during much of Galante's rule, had his own loyalists who felt they deserved recognition for staying loyal during hard times. Tensions were rising, friendships were changing, suspicions were growing. The family was heading toward another internal crisis, another round of bloodshed, and Sonny Black, Lefty Ruggiero, and Donnie Brasco would be right in the middle of it. Joseph Pistone was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1939. In 1981, the tensions inside the Bonano family reached a breaking point. The fight centered on three captains: Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Philly Lucky Giacconi, and Dominick Big Trin Trinchera. These three captains, who had been key in organizing the hit on Carmine Galante, felt that they deserved more power and influence inside the family. They believed their part in getting rid of Galante should be rewarded with positions in the family leadership. But Philip Rastelli, the official boss, and his loyalists saw things differently. From their view, these three captains were becoming too ambitious, too powerful, possibly threatening the set ranks. There were also practical worries. The three captains controlled important crews and area, and their growing influence might let them challenge Rastelli's leadership. The commission, the ruling group made of the bosses of the five families, was asked about the situation. This was standard for big internal family fights. The commission's role was to keep stability across the families, to settle fights before they grew into full wars that would bring police attention to everyone. The commission sided with Rastelli. The three rebellious captains were seen as disruptive, possibly dangerous to the stability not just of the Bonano family, but of the whole New York Mafia. The decision was made. The three captains had to go. But doing this decision needed careful planning. These were not low-level soldiers who could simply be called to a meeting and killed. These were captains with their own crews, their own soldiers, their own friends. They would be suspicious of any unusual requests or situations. The hit would have to be done perfectly to avoid warning them beforehand, and to make sure they could all be gotten rid of at the same time. Sonny Black was chosen to play a key part in organizing the hit. This was important on many levels. First, it showed that Sonny was trusted by the leadership and by the commission. Second, it put Sonny in position to possibly take over the crews and areas of the killed captains, greatly increasing his power inside the family. Third, and most ominously, it meant that Sonny would be directly involved in the murder of three made members, a serious action with serious results if anything went wrong. The plan was made over weeks. The three captains would be called to a meeting, supposedly to discuss family business. The meeting would be held at a place that could be controlled. Once they arrived, they would be killed quickly and efficiently. Their bodies would be disposed of so they could not be found, leaving their families and crews unsure about what had happened. Unable to immediately strike back, Donnie Brasco was there for some of the planning talks. He listened as Sonny and others discussed details, where the meeting would be held, who would do the actual shooting, how the bodies would be disposed of, what would be told to the three captains' crews afterward. He recorded everything, passing it all along to his FBI handlers for the FBI. This presented a moral and legal problem. They had advanced knowledge that three people were going to be murdered. Did they have a duty to warn the targets? Did they have a duty to step in and prevent the murders? Or did they allow it to happen to keep Pistone's cover and the completeness of the operation? The FBI made the decision to let it proceed. This was argued then, and is still argued now. The reason was that warning the three captains would expose Pistone and destroy the operation, and that the long-term goal of taking apart the whole Bonano family made allowing these three murders to proceed okay. It was a practical calculation, 3 deaths now to prevent dozens or hundreds of deaths later, to bring down a whole criminal organization. Whether this reason was enough is a matter of ethics and law that has been discussed a lot since. What is certain is that the FBI made the decision not to step in, and the murders happened as planned, May 5, 1981. The three captains, Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Giacconi, and Dominick Trinchera, were called to a sit-down at a clubhouse on 56th Street in Bushwick, Brooklyn, under the idea of fixing internal issues, a place that seemed neutral enough not to raise immediate suspicion. But that could be controlled by Sonny Black and his friends. The three captains arrived. Possibly with some suspicion. Men in their position were always suspicious, but not enough to stop them from coming. Once inside, the situation got worse quickly. Guns were pulled. The three captains were shot at close range, killed almost instantly after the murders. The bodies were moved and buried in a far area near Ozone Park, Queens, in what became known as the Mafia Cemetery, or the Hole, an undeveloped piece of land later tied to multiple mob burials. The hit was successful from an operational view. All three targets were gone. There were no surviving witnesses outside the planners. The bodies were not immediately found, creating confusion and uncertainty among the three captains' crews and families. For several days, no one outside the planners knew for sure what had happened, though rumors began to spread fast for Sonny Black. The successful hit was life-changing. He had proven himself capable of doing a major approved hit against high-ranking members. He had shown his loyalty to Restelli and to the Commission. As a reward, he was raised in the family ranks. He took over important area and crews. He became one of the most powerful captains in the Bonano family, possibly in position to become underboss or even eventually boss. This was the peak of Sonny Black's career. He had achieved real power, real influence. He commanded respect throughout the family and across the 5 families. He had wealth, position, and the satisfaction of having risen from the Brooklyn streets to the top of mafia ranks. And through all of this, Donnie Brasco was there. He was there for planning talks. He was trusted enough to be told about the hit in advance. He was part of Sonny's inner circle, allowed to know the most sensitive family business for Pistone and the FBI. This was exactly what they had been working toward. They had an undercover agent deeply inside the highest levels of a mafia family, with direct knowledge of murders, criminal plans, and family operations. The evidence being gathered was amazing, detailed first-hand accounts of mafia activities, recorded conversations, recorded crimes, but the operation could not continue forever. Pistone had been undercover for over 5 years now, and knew length. The mental toll was severe. He was basically living as Donnie Brasco full-time. With only short moments as Joseph Pistone, his marriage was under huge strain. His wife barely saw him, lived in fear for his safety, and struggled with the lies and deception that had taken over their lives. The FBI was worried about Pistone's well-being and about the risks of continuing the operation. There were also practical worries. The longer Pistone remained undercover, the bigger the risk of being found out, and with Sonny Black now in a position of important power, having been directly involved in multiple murders, the results of being found out would be disastrous. If the mob discovered that Donnie Brasco was an FBI agent, they would not just kill him, they would torture him first, trying to learn what he told the FBI. Who else might be cooperating? How much damage had been done? And it was not just Pistone who would be at risk. Lefty Ruggiero, who had vouched for Donnie so completely, would certainly be killed for bringing a rat into the family. Sonny Black, who had trusted Donnie and brought him into sensitive operations, would face the same fate. Others who had dealt with Donnie, who had trusted him, who had committed crimes in his presence, all of them would be under suspicion. And mob suspicion tended to result in mob violence. The FBI began planning how to end the operation. They needed to pull Pistone out before he was discovered, but they also wanted to maximize the information value and the prosecution impact of what they had learned. The timing would be critical. As the spring of 1981 turned to summer, events began to speed up. The FBI was preparing to take Pistone out and to use the evidence he had gathered to charge many members of the Bonano family. Inside the Bonano family, Sonny Black was taking his power after the successful hit on the 3 captains. And Donnie Brasco continued his daily routine, meeting with Lefty, going to the social club. discussing crimes, gathering evidence, always aware that each day could be his last if his cover was blown. The stage was set for the final act, for the discovery that would destroy Sonny Black's world and send shockwaves through the whole American Mafia. July 26, 1981. The day started like any other for Sonny Black. He went to the Motion Lounge, met with members of his crew, discussed various ongoing operations. Lefty Ruggiero was there, as he usually was. They talked about various matters, potential jobs, problems that needed dealing with, the daily business of running a criminal business. Donnie Brasco was not there. That was not immediately unusual. Sometimes Donnie had other things to take care of, other appointments. But as the morning went on and Donnie did not appear, Lefty started to wonder. He tried to reach Donnie, calling the numbers he had, no answer. Then the phone call started coming into the Motion Lounge. Other families, other crews had started hearing rumors. Something about a major FBI operation, something about an undercover agent, something about the Bonano family being gotten into. At first, it seemed impossible. The Bonano family had been around for decades. They had ways of doing things. They checked people carefully. They were suspicious of everyone. How could an FBI agent get that deep? But the rumors kept coming, and they were specific. An FBI agent named Joe Pistone had been undercover in the Bonano family for 6 years. He had gone by the name Donnie Brasco. He had worked with Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black's crew. He had taken part in crimes, gathered evidence, recorded conversations. When Sonny Black heard this, when he first heard the name Donnie Brasco connected to the word agent, he must have felt a moment of complete disbelief. Donnie, the kid who had been with them for years, the capable earner, the loyal friend, the guy he had been planning to sponsor for membership, an FBI agent. But as more information came in, as the rumors were confirmed, as the reality became undeniable, that disbelief must have given way to a cold, terrible certainty. Donnie Brasco was Special Agent Joe Pistone. For 6 years, the FBI had been inside the Bonano family, and Sonny Black had been one of the main contacts, one of the people who had trusted him, worked with him, confided in him. The meanings were immediately clear to Sonny. He had vouched for a federal agent. He had brought him into sensitive operations. He had discussed murders in Donnie's presence. He had made him part of the crew, brought him to meetings, treated him like family in the Mafia. There was only one penalty for that level of failure. Sonny knew it. Everyone knew it. The rules were absolute and had been for generations. If you vouched for someone and they turned out to be a rat, you paid with your life, no exceptions, no appeals, no mercy. Lefty Ruggiero's situation was even worse. Lefty had been Donnie's main contact, his teacher, the person who had vouched for him most completely. Lefty had spent nearly every day with Donnie for years. He had brought him into the family, taught him the ways, trusted him completely. The betrayal must have been destroying on a personal level. But the practical results were even worse. Lefty was a dead man walking. The FBI had pulled Pistone out just in time. They had known that once the operation was exposed, the mob's reaction would be fast and brutal. Pistone went immediately into protective custody, starting a process that would finally result in his permanent move under a new identity. He would spend the rest of his life in witness protection, always looking over his shoulder, always aware that the mob had long memories and that the contracts on his life would never be taken back. For Sonny Black and Lefty Ruggiero, there was no protective custody, no escape. They were members of the Mafia, and they would live or die by its rules. And the rules were very clear about what happened to men who brought a rat into the family. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the Bonano family was in crisis. The FBI had gathered evidence on many made members and associates. They knew about murders, extortions, hijackings, gambling operations, loan sharking, and various other criminal activities. Charges would be coming, arrests would be made. Prosecutions would follow, but the internal family crisis was even more severe. The infiltration was humiliating. The Bonano family, already looked down upon by the other families because of the Bonano Wars of the 1960s, had now been exposed as having been gotten into by an FBI agent for 6 years. Their checking procedures had failed. Their supposedly unbreakable code of omerta had been broken. Their secrets had been exposed. The commission had to respond. A meeting was called. Sonny Black was asked to explain himself, to account for how this disastrous failure had happened under his watch. The commission wanted answers, wanted to understand how an FBI agent had gotten so deep into the Bonano family, wanted to make sure that this kind of penetration could not happen in other families. Sonny must have known that this meeting would not end well for him. The commission was not looking for explanations or excuses. They were looking for someone to blame, someone to punish, someone whose execution would send a message that this kind of failure would not be allowed. But Sonny also knew that refusing to attend the meeting was not an option. In the Mafia, when the commission calls you, you go. To refuse would be an even bigger sign of disrespect, would mark you as having left the family, would make you a target not just for execution, but for a manhunt that would reach across the country. So Sonny began preparing for what he knew was coming. He started putting his affairs in order. He paid off debts in the mob. Dying with unpaid debts was a serious dishonor that would reflect badly on your family and friends. He had quiet talks with people he cared about, saying goodbye without saying goodbye, because to clearly admit he was about to be killed would itself be a breaking of the code. Lefty Ruggiero was in an even more desperate situation. He had been Donnie's main contact, had spent more time with him than anyone else, had vouched for him most completely, by all rights. Lefty should have been executed immediately. But Lefty got lucky, if you can call it that. The FBI, knowing that Lefty would be killed once the operation was exposed, moved fast to arrest him on federal charges. Lefty was taken into custody before the mob could get to him. This saved Lefty's life but sentenced him to prison. He was found guilty on various charges related to the criminal activities that Pistone had recorded, and sentenced to big prison time. He would die in prison years later, never having fully gotten over the betrayal, from the knowledge that the person he trusted most, the person he treated like a son, had been an FBI agent all along. But Sonny did not have even that bitter comfort. There would be no arrest to save him, no protective custody, no escape. He had lived his whole life by the Mafia code, and now that code demanded his death. The time between the discovery on July 26th and Sonny's final meeting on August 17th must have been unreal. Sonny continued going about his business, keeping up appearances, but everyone knew what was coming. In the mob, this was not unusual. When someone was marked for death, there was often a time where they continued their routine, knowing but not admitting that the end was near. Sonny had talks during this time that have been reported by various sources. He spoke with his girlfriend, with family members, with friends. He was calm, accepting, taking of his fate. This was the code. This was what being a man of honor meant. You did not run. You did not beg. You did not become a rat yourself to avoid the results. There are reports that Sonny gave away some of his things during this time, not in an obvious way that would admit what was about to happen, but in a way that made sure people he cared about would have something to remember him by. He settled debts, made sure his money affairs were in order, said his goodbyes in the indirect way that men in his position had to say goodbye. Other members of the crew during this time must have been going through their own mental pain. They had worked with Donnie Brasco, had committed crimes with him, had trusted him. Now they were learning that everything had been a lie, that the FBI had evidence of everything they had done. Some of them would be arrested, some would be charged. Some might turn informant themselves, faced with long prison sentences. The Bonano family was falling apart. The infiltration had exposed so much criminal activity, had recorded so many crimes that the prosecutions would be destroying. The family would never fully recover. Their power and influence would be permanently reduced. Other families would distance themselves, not wanting to be connected with an organization that had proven so open to law enforcement penetration. And at the center of it all was Sonny Black, waiting for the unavoidable call. The morning of August 17, 1981, Sonny Black received the call he had been expecting, a meeting. He was told to come alone. Told the location, told when to arrive. The details were few, which was itself meaningful. Normally, meetings would have more context. Who else would be there? What would be discussed? Why it was being called? The vagueness was a message in itself. Sonny dressed carefully that morning. Black clothing as always, clean, presentable, dignified. If you are going to die, you die looking like a man of respect. Not like someone who has fallen apart, who has lost their calm. Appearance mattered, especially at the end. He made that final call to his girlfriend. If anything happens to me, I want you to know I love you, not a clear admission of what was about to happen. That would break the code, would be seen as weakness or fear. But a message nonetheless, a way of saying goodbye. Then he left his apartment and headed to the meeting. He went willingly, calmly, knowingly. This was not ignorance or naivety. Sonny Black was a sophisticated, experienced mobster. He had been in the life for decades. He had taken part in hits, had probably done them himself. He knew exactly what this meeting was. He went anyway. Why? Why not run? Why not go to the FBI, turn informant, seek protection? Surely life in witness protection, however hard, was better than death. For Sonny Black, that was not even a thought. To become a rat, to break omerta, to work with law enforcement, that would be worse than death. It would dishonor everything he believed in his whole life. It would mark him as a coward and a traitor. It would endanger everyone he had ever worked with. It would make his whole life meaningless, more than that. It would break his deepest sense of self. Sonny Black was a man of honor, by his understanding of that term. He had made an oath when he was made, had sworn to put the family before everything, including his own life. That oath was not just words. It was a sacred promise, the guiding rule of his existence. So when the family called, demanding his life as payment for his failure, Sonny Black honored that promise. He went to his execution the same way he had lived his life by the code. With dignity, without complaint. The details of what happened at that meeting have never been fully confirmed. These things are done in secret, with no witnesses outside the people involved, and those people do not talk. But based on how these executions typically went, and based on what was finally discovered, we can put together the general outline. Sonny would have arrived at the set location. He would have been met by other MAID members, men he knew, men he had worked with. There might have been some short talk, some final words. Or there might have been nothing, just the sudden violence that marked the end. He was shot, probably at close range, probably many times to make sure death was instant. There was no torture, no long suffering. That was not the point. This was not about revenge or cruelty. It was about enforcement of the code, about keeping discipline, about sending a message that the rules applied to everyone. Even respected captains. After death came disposal. The body had to disappear, at least for a while. Finding the body would start a police investigation, would create problems. So Sonny's body was taken to a pre-arranged place for burial, and then, in a final brutal touch, pure mafia symbolism, his hands were cut off. In the mafia, symbols and messages matter hugely. Violence is not just functional, it is communicative. How someone is killed, what is done to their body, where it is left, all of these communicate meaning to those who understand the language. Cutting off the hands of a dead mobster sends a specific message. He didn't know who he was touching. It means the dead person connected with or vouched for someone he should not have. brought someone into the organization who should not have been there, metaphorically touched people on behalf of someone who was untouchable. For Sonny Black, the symbolism was brutally right. He had literally brought Donnie Brasco into contact with made members, with captains, with family business. He had vouched for an FBI agent, had put his hands on that agent's shoulder in a gesture of trust and support. And in doing so, he had contaminated the family, had brought the enemy into the inner circle. The cut-off hands were a warning and a message that would finally be understood. Throughout the underworld, this is what happens when you fail to properly check someone. When you trust the wrong person, when you compromise the family security. Your death will not be the end. You will be marked in death as you were marked in life. As someone who made an unforgivable mistake, Sonny's body, with his hands cut off, was buried in a place that was not immediately found. For months, his fate was officially unsure. His family did not know for sure what had happened. His crew could not confirm his death. There were rumors, of course, in the mob. There are always rumors, but no one knew for certain. This uncertainty served a purpose. It kept everyone on edge, kept people wondering and worried. It meant that Sonny's friends, the people who had worked with him and with Donnie Brasco, could not be sure of their own status. Were they safe? Were they under suspicion too? Would they be next? The psychological war was as important as the physical violence. In 1982, over 6 months after his disappearance, Sonny Black's body was finally found. It was found in a creek on Staten Island, a place that had been carefully chosen to hide the body. But not to hide it forever. The mob wanted the body to be found finally. Just not immediately. The delay served their purposes. But finally the discovery would serve their purposes too. When the body was found, it was in an advanced state of decay. Identification was hard, but was finally made through dental records and other forensic means, confirming what everyone in the underworld already knew. The hands had been cut off, removed at the wrists in a clean cut that suggested planning rather than rage. The discovery made headlines. The Donnie Brasco case had already been national news. The new 6-year FBI infiltration of the Mafia was one of the biggest law enforcement successes in history. Now there was a body, a murdered captain. A concrete example of the mob's brutal response to the infiltration for law enforcement. The discovery was a proof of their decision to pull Pistone out when they did. If they had waited even a few more weeks, if the operation had been exposed while Pistone was still inside, he would have suffered the same fate as Sonny Black. The mob's response to the infiltration had been exactly as predicted: fast, brutal, and unforgiving for the Bonano family. The discovery was a final chapter in the Donnie Brasco disaster. Sonny Black was dead. Lefty Ruggiero was in prison. Many other members and associates were under charge. The family's operations had been exposed and disrupted. Their reputation was permanently damaged. The other families looked at them with a mix of pity and dislike. For Sonny Black's family and loved ones, the discovery brought certainty, but no peace. They had known probably what had happened, but having it confirmed, having the body, seeing the evidence of the brutal end, that was its own trauma. They had lost someone they loved to the violent world he had chosen to live in. And there was no way to fix it, no justice they could seek, no way to deal with the loss except to bear it. The Donnie Brasco operation had far-reaching results that went well beyond Sonny Black's murder. The FBI used the evidence gathered by Pistone to charge many members of the Bonano family and associates from other families. The prosecutions were successful. Many mobsters were found guilty and sentenced to big prison terms. Lefty Ruggiero, as mentioned, was found guilty and imprisoned. He served time in federal prison and was finally released, but never got over the betrayal. He had trusted Donnie Brasco completely, had treated him like a son, had vouched for him with his own life. The discovery that it had all been a lie, that he had been fooled for years, that his friendship had been fake, it broke something in Lefty. He died in 1994. A broken man who had lost everything to the life he had chosen and to the betrayal he never saw coming. Anthony Mira, who had first introduced Donnie Brasco into the Bonano family, was murdered in 1982. The mob blamed him for bringing the agent into the family in the first place. Even though Lefty and Sonny had finally been the main contacts, Mira was shot and killed. His body left in a place where it would be quickly found no need for symbolism or mystery. This was just cleanup, getting rid of someone who had been part of the problem. Various other members of Sonny's crew faced results ranging from arrest and prosecution to internal family punishments. The crew was broken up, its area given to others, its operations disrupted. Some members turned informant, working with law enforcement to lower their own sentences. Others went to prison, keeping omerta, refusing to cooperate even when faced with decades behind bars. The Bonano family as a whole was destroyed. They lost their commission seat again. They had gotten it back after the Bonano Wars. But the Donnie Brasco infiltration was seen as such a disastrous security failure that the other families voted to remove them from the commission. They were effectively demoted, treated as a second-tier family. Their opinions no longer asked or valued in inter-family matters. Their operations were disrupted by the wave of arrests and prosecutions. Their reputation was permanently damaged. They were the family that had been gotten into by an FBI agent for 6 years, that had been so completely compromised that their secrets were now in the hands of law enforcement. Other families were reluctant to work with them, to share information with them, to trust them with sensitive matters. The damage went beyond just the Bonano family. The whole New York Mafia was shaken by the successful infiltration. If it could happen to the Bonanos, it could happen to any family. Paranoia increased. Checking procedures were tightened. The suspicion and mistrust that had always marked mob life got stronger. Men who had been friends for decades began to wonder if their friend might be an agent. Conversations became more guarded. The omerta that had always been central to the Mafia's survival became even more rigid. For Joseph Pistone, the end of the operation was just the start of a new and hard chapter. He was immediately put in witness protection, given a new identity, moved to a place far from New York. The FBI could not take any chances. The contract on Pistone's life was real, substantial, and would never be taken back. The mob had long memories and big resources. If they ever found him, they would kill him. Living in witness protection is a strange existence. You have to give up everything from your old life, your name, your hometown, your job identity, your relationships with everyone except immediate family. You have to be constantly watchful, always aware that a moment of carelessness could expose you. You can never fully relax, never fully trust that you are safe. Pistone's marriage had been under huge strain during the undercover operation. He had been basically absent for 6 years, living as Donnie Brasco, unavailable to his wife and children except for short, irregular visits. The stress had been huge. After the operation ended, they had to rebuild their relationship while also adjusting to witness protection, to a new location, to new identities, to the constant awareness of danger. Pistone finally wrote a book about his experiences, Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, published in 1988. The book was a bestseller and was later made into a film starring Johnny Depp as Pistone Brasco and Al Pacino as Lefty Ruggiero. The film dramatized many parts of the story, taking some freedoms with the facts but catching the basic dynamics of the operation and the relationships involved. The book and film brought Pistone a measure of fame, but also additional danger by making his story public. He made himself a more visible target, the mob, which might have finally stopped actively searching for him if he had stayed quietly hidden, now had fresh reason to find and kill the man who had become famous for getting inside them. Pistone has lived the rest of his life under this shadow. He has done speaking events, consulting work on organized crime, even some training for law enforcement. But always carefully, always aware of the risks. Always taking precautions. He is an old man now, decades away from his time as Donnie Brasco. But the danger has never fully passed. In interviews over the years, Pistone has been asked repeatedly about his feelings regarding Sonny Black, Lefty Ruggiero, and the other mobsters he got to know during the operation. His answers have been complex and, to his credit, honest about the moral uncertainty of what he did. He has admitted having real affection for some of these men, particularly Lefty. He has said that he came to see them as human beings, not just as criminals to be arrested. He understood their motivations, their codes, their loyalties. He saw their humanity even as he was betraying them. But he has also been clear that he does not regret the operation. These were criminals who had committed murders, extortions, and many other serious crimes. They had made a choice to live outside the law, to hurt people for profit, to enforce their will through violence and intimidation. The fact that they were also human beings with families and friendships and codes of honor did not undo the harm they caused. Pistone has been particularly thoughtful about Sonny Black. He has admitted that Sonny was a victim of his own code, that his loyalty and honor, admirable qualities in many contexts, were what killed him. Sonny's fatal flaw was not that he was a bad person by his own lights. It was that he was a good person by the wrong lights. That the code he lived by was basically corrupt, even if he followed it faithfully. The Donnie Brasco operation had important effects on how law enforcement approached organized crime infiltration. Before Pistone's operation, long-term undercover penetration of the Mafia was considered nearly impossible. The common wisdom was that the mob's checking procedures, their paranoia, their secrecy made deep penetration unachievable. Pistone proved that wrong. He showed that with the right cover story, the right personality, the right approach, and a huge amount of patience and courage, it was possible to get to the heart of a Mafia family. This opened up new possibilities for law enforcement. But the operation also revealed the huge costs and risks of such infiltration. Pistone was undercover for 6 years, and knew an almost unbearable length. The mental toll on him was severe. The strain on his family was huge. The ethical compromises required taking part in crimes, seeing crimes without stepping in, allowing murders to proceed to protect his cover were important and troubling. The FBI had to develop new rules for supporting undercover agents in long-term operations. They had to think more carefully about the limits of what they would allow agents to do to keep cover. They had to consider the long-term effects on agents' mental health and family stability. They had to weigh the information value of continued infiltration against the human costs to their agents, and, in some cases, to the innocent victims of the crimes that were not prevented. The operation also changed how the mob worked. After Donnie Brasco, the Mafia became even more paranoid and suspicious. They tightened their checking procedures, made it harder for outsiders to get access, became more careful about what was said and to whom. In some ways, this made the mob less effective. The increased paranoia could lower trust, made it harder to conduct business efficiently, but it also made later infiltration attempts much more difficult. The Donnie Brasco case became required study for both law enforcement and organized crime researchers. It was taken apart in law schools, criminology departments, FBI training programs. Books were written analyzing every part of the operation. It became the model for understanding both the possibilities and the limits of long-term undercover work. Sonny Black's story is, at its heart, a tragedy about loyalty. He was not killed because he was disloyal, quite the opposite. He was killed because he was too loyal, because he believed too completely in a code that finally had no room for human error. No forgiveness for honest mistakes, no mercy for good men who made bad judgments. The Mafia Code Omerta, loyalty to family above all else. Honor among thieves has a tempting quality. It promises brotherhood, belonging, meaning, purpose. It provides structure and ranks in chaotic situations. It offers clear rules in a world where the law is seen as the enemy and regular society is viewed with suspicion. For men like Sonny Black, growing up in neighborhoods where organized crime was a fact of life, the Mafia offered something that regular society often did not respect: power and a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. But the code is also basically corrupt and self-destructive. It demands absolute loyalty to an organization that will kill you without hesitation if you become inconvenient or embarrassing. It requires you to put the interests of the family above your own life, your own family, your own conscience. It forbids cooperation with legitimate law enforcement while enforcing its own rules through violence and murder. Sonny Black lived by this code faithfully his whole adult life. He honored his promises, he kept omerta, he put the family first. He showed respect, showed loyalty, proved his worth. And when the code demanded his death, he accepted that too, going to his execution willingly rather than break the principles he had lived by. Was this admirable? In a certain sense, yes, there is something grimly respectable about a man who lives and dies by his principles, who does not compromise or make excuses when the results come due. Sonny Black was not a hypocrite. He did not demand loyalty from others while betraying it himself. He did not try to escape the penalty he knew was set for his failure. But it is also deeply tragic and wasteful. Sonny Black died at 48 years old. Killed by the organization he had served faithfully. Killed for a mistake he had made in good faith. Killed because an FBI agent was better at playing a mobster than Sonny was at spotting a fake. His death served no good purpose. It did not bring justice, did not prevent future crimes, did not protect innocence. It was simply organizational discipline, the mob enforcing its rules to keep credibility and control. Beyond the main players, Sonny, Lefty, Pistone, the Donnie Brasco operation had ripple effects that touched dozens or hundreds of lives. Consider all the people who were affected. The families of the murdered men, Sonny Black's girlfriend, his relatives, his children, if he had any. They lost someone they loved to violence with no way to fix it and no justice. The families of the 3 captains murdered in May 1981, whose deaths the FBI had advanced knowledge of but allowed to proceed. They lost fathers, husbands, brothers, whatever these men had done in their criminal careers. They had families who loved them and mourned them. The families of the mobsters who were arrested and imprisoned based on evidence gathered by Pistone. Wives who lost husbands to long prison sentences. Children who grew up without fathers. Extended families who lost breadwinners and providers. Yes, these men had chosen a criminal life, but their families often had little choice in the matter and paid a price for crimes they did not commit. Pistone's own family, his wife and children, who lived for 6 years with the fear that he might be discovered and killed, who had to move and take new identities when the operation ended, who could not have normal relationships or a normal life because of his work. They paid a price for his dedication to the job. The victims of crimes that Pistone took part in or saw while keeping his cover. The truck drivers who were scared during hijackings. The business owners who paid protection money. The debtors who were threatened or beaten. These were real people who suffered real harm. And while Pistone's part might be okay because of the larger goal of the operation, that does not erase the harm those individuals experienced. The other mobsters who, while criminals themselves, became collateral damage in the operation, men who were murdered by the mob because they were suspected of being informants even though they were not. Men who were caught in the paranoia that followed the exposure of the infiltration. Men whose careers and lives were destroyed, not because they had done anything wrong by mob standards, but because they had been connected with Donnie Brasco and were now under suspicion. When we add all of this up, all the deaths, all the imprisonments, all the broken families, all the mental trauma, all the lives disrupted, it becomes clear that the Donnie Brasco operation, whatever its law enforcement successes, came at a huge human cost. Whether that cost was okay is a question that does not have a simple answer from a practical law enforcement view. The operation was a huge success. It led to multiple convictions, disrupted organized crime operations, damaged the Bonano family's abilities, and showed that mafia infiltration was possible. The knowledge gained about mafia structure and operations was very valuable for future law enforcement efforts. From an ethical view, the calculations are more complicated. The FBI allowed murders to proceed to protect Pistone's cover. They allowed Pistone to take part in various crimes. They made choices that resulted in deaths and imprisonments that might not have happened if the operation had been done differently or not at all. There is also a wider question about whether the war on organized crime done through these means is worth the costs. The mafia still exists, decades after the Donnie Brasco operation. Organized crime continues. New organizations come up to fill the spaces left by prosecuted mobsters. The cycle continues. Was this particular operation, with all its human costs, truly worth it in the long run? These are questions without easy answers. Questions that reasonable people can disagree about. What is certain is that Sonny Black paid the highest price for an operation he never knew he was part of, a war he never knew he was fighting. At the center of the Sonny Black story is a basic question about the nature of betrayal. Who betrayed whom? And what does betrayal mean in a situation where everyone involved has chosen to live outside regular moral frameworks? From the mob's view, the betrayal is clear. Donnie Brasco Joseph Pistone betrayed the trust of the men who befriended him, worked with him, treated him like family. He lied about his identity, his background, his intentions. He gathered evidence against men who had shown him nothing but acceptance and loyalty. He pretended to be something he was not, and that pretense resulted in deaths and imprisonments. This is real betrayal by any definition. Pistone built relationships deliberately and coldly for the purpose of destroying the people he was building relationships with. The fact that it was his job, that it was allowed by the FBI, that it was in service of law enforcement goals, none of that changes the fact that he betrayed personal trust for professional purposes. But from Pistone's view, from law enforcement's view, there was no betrayal. He was an FBI agent doing his job. The mobsters he was investigating were criminals involved in serious crimes, including murder. They had made a choice to live outside the law, to hurt people for profit, to enforce their will through violence. They were not innocents being unfairly targeted. They were career criminals who had victimized countless people over decades. Moreover, any trust the mobsters placed in Pistone was based on a misunderstanding. They thought he was a fellow criminal, when he was actually an agent of law enforcement. You cannot betray a trust that was never legitimately given because it was based on a basic deception about who you were. The mobsters were not betrayed, they were simply caught. Both views have truth, which is what makes the story so morally complex. Pistone did build personal relationships for the purpose of destroying the people he was building relationships with. That is a betrayal of personal trust, regardless of the professional reason. But he was also doing his job as a law enforcement officer investigating serious criminals, gathering evidence of serious crimes. That is not betrayal. That is justice. Sonny Black was both a victim and a victimizer. He was a career criminal who had committed many crimes, probably including murder. He had hurt people, scared people, profited from violence and fear by regular moral standards. He deserved prosecution and imprisonment, but he was also a man who had been deceived by someone he trusted, who had been fooled for years by someone pretending to be his friend, who was killed by his own organization for a mistake that was not really his fault. By any standard, that is tragic. The complexity here reflects a larger truth about undercover operations and the war on organized crime. There are no clean victories, no purely right outcomes. Every success comes with costs and complications. Every conviction represents both justice for past crimes and human tragedy for the convicted and their families. Every betrayal serves law enforcement purposes while also involving real betrayal of personal relationships. The story of Sonny Black offers various lessons, depending on your view and what you are trying to learn for law enforcement. The lesson is about the possibilities and costs of deep infiltration. Pistone showed that it could be done. You could get to the heart of a mafia family if you were willing to pay the price in time, stress, ethical compromises, and personal sacrifice. But the operation also showed the limits of what could be achieved. Despite the huge success of the infiltration, despite the many convictions and the damage to the Bonano family, organized crime continued. The mob adapted, became more paranoid and careful, but did not disappear. The cost-benefit calculation of such operations remains complicated. For those studying organized crime, the lesson is about the structure and function of mafia families, about how the code of omerta works in practice, about what loyalty means in a criminal context. Sonny Black's story shows how the mob's emphasis on loyalty and honor, which in some ways strengthens the organization, also makes it brittle and self-destructive. The same code that binds members together also requires the execution of men like Sonny when they make mistakes, which finally weakens the organization by killing its own capable members. For those interested in ethics and moral philosophy, the lesson is about the complexity of judgment when dealing with people who have chosen to live outside regular moral frameworks. Sonny Black was at the same time a loyal, honorable man by his own code and a criminal who had committed serious crimes by society's standards. Can both things be true? How do we judge someone who faithfully follows a corrupt code? What do we owe to criminals who have been deceived by undercover agents? These questions do not have simple answers. For anyone thinking about a life in organized crime, and this seems to be one of the intended audiences for retelling this story, the lesson is stark and clear. Loyalty is not returned in the mob. You are expected to die for the family, but the family will kill you without hesitation if you become inconvenient. Sonny Black did everything right by mob standards. He showed respect, he honored the code. He went to his death without complaint, and he still died brutally at 48. His hands cut off as a message, his body dumped in a creek. That is what loyalty to the mob gets you. Over the decades since Sonny Black's death, and the exposure of the Donnie Brasco operation, the story has become part of legend. The 1997 film Donnie Brasco dramatized events, compressed timelines, created combined characters, and emphasized certain emotional moments while downplaying others. The film is excellent as cinema, but takes big freedoms with the facts. Books about the case, including Pistone's own memoir, have shaped how we understand the story. They provide detail and context, but also reflect the biases and views of their authors. Pistone's book naturally emphasizes his courage and the importance of the operation while downplaying the ethical complications and the human cost to his targets. True crime shows, podcasts, documentaries, and articles have retold the story countless times, each adding their own spin, their own emphasis, their own interpretation. The story has been used to show various points: the bravery of law enforcement, the violence of the mafia, the tragedy of misplaced loyalty, the complexity of undercover work. But beneath all the legend and retelling is a real story about real people. Dominick "Sonny Black" Napolitano was a real person who lived a real life and died a real death. He was not a character in a story. He was a human being with hopes, fears, relationships, and choices. The same is true for Lefty Ruggiero, for Joe Pistone, for all the other people touched by this operation. The real Sonny Black was probably more complex than any portrayal of him could catch. He was likely sometimes generous and sometimes cruel, sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, sometimes loyal and sometimes calculating. He lived in a world with its own rules and logic. A world that seems foreign and almost impossible to understand to those of us who have never been part of it. What we know for sure is that he was a captain in the Bonano crime family in the late 1970s and early 1980s. That he was trusted enough to play a key part in the murder of 3 rebellious captains. That he accepted and worked with an FBI agent he knew as Donnie Brasco. And that he was executed by his own organization on August 17, 1981. His hands cut off to send a message about his failure. We know that his body was found months later in a Staten Island creek. That his death was one of the final acts in the drama of the Donnie Brasco infiltration. And that his story has been told and retold for decades as a warning tale about loyalty, betrayal, and the brutal realities of organized crime. In regular stories, we often look for redemption, a moment where the main character realizes their errors, makes amends, finds salvation. There's no redemption in Sonny Black's story. He died believing in the code, following it to the end, never wavering in his loyalty to an organization that killed him for an honest mistake. Some might see this as admirable in a tragic way, a man who stood by his principles to the end. Others might see it as simply sad, a man so trapped in a corrupt system that he could not even save himself when he had the chance. What is clear is that Sonny never saw his life as needing redemption. From his view, he had lived honorably according to the standards of his world. He had been a good earner, a respected captain, a loyal member. The fact that he had been deceived by an FBI agent was not a moral failing on his part. It was simply bad luck. A skilled opponent, a new infiltration. His acceptance of his execution was not about redemption or atonement. It was about consistency. Living and dying by the same code, honoring his promises to the end. Refusing to become what he hated, a rat, an informant, a betrayer of the family. Even to save his own life, for observers, particularly those with regular moral frameworks, this can be hard to understand or accept. How can someone go so willingly to their death for an organization that is killing them? How can loyalty be more important than survival? How can a code that demands such sacrifice keep any followers? The answer lies in understanding that for men like Sonny Black, the code was not just a set of rules, it was an identity. Being Bonano family, being a man of honor, being someone who could be trusted and respected, that is who he was. To break the code would be to destroy that identity, to become nothing, to make his whole life meaningless. Better to die as Sonny Black, respected captain who honored his promises, than to live as a rat, hated and hunted, knowing that everything you had believed in was a lie. That was the calculation, and Sonny made it without hesitation. Whether that calculation was right or wrong, wise or foolish, admirable or tragic, that is for each person to judge for themselves. What is undeniable is that it was consistent with everything Sonny Black had been throughout his life. Today, more than 4 decades after Sonny Black's execution, the Donnie Brasco operation remains one of the most famous and important undercover operations in law enforcement history. It is studied in FBI training, analyzed in criminology courses, dramatized in films and books, discussed in podcasts and documentaries. The Bonano family still exists, but never fully got over the infiltration and the prosecutions that followed. They remain one of New York's 5 families, but they are reduced in power and influence, their glory days long behind them. The mob as a whole has declined greatly since the 1980s, weakened by prosecutions, by changing social conditions, by the rise of other forms of organized crime. Joe Pistone, now in his 80s, lives somewhere in America under a new identity, still protected by the government, still looking over his shoulder even after all these years. He has given occasional interviews, done some consulting work, written books about his experiences, but he can never fully escape the shadow of those 6 years he spent as Donnie Brasco. Benjamin Lefty Guns Ruggiero died in 1994. Having served his prison time and been released, but never having gotten over the betrayal. He died knowing that the person he trusted most, the person he treated like a son, had been an FBI agent gathering evidence against him the whole time. The families of Sonny Black, Lefty, and all the others affected by the operation have had to carry on with their lives, bearing the weight of these events, dealing with losses that can never be fully processed or resolved. The story of Sonny Black leaves us with questions that do not have easy answers. Was the Donnie Brasco operation worth the human costs? The convictions were important, the information valuable, the disruption of organized crime substantial, but men died who might not have died otherwise. Families were destroyed, lives were broken. Can we measure that and decide if the trade-off was worth it? What do we owe to people who have chosen a criminal life? They are still human beings with families and feelings and their own moral codes. They are also criminals who have hurt people and broken laws. How do we balance our duty to enforce the law with our recognition of their humanity? Is there honor among thieves? The Mafia claims to value loyalty, respect, and honor, but they also execute their own members for honest mistakes, profit from hurting people, and enforce their code through violence and fear. Can a corrupt code contain real virtue? Can loyalty to an evil organization be considered honorable? What does betrayal mean when everyone involved has chosen to live outside regular moral frameworks? Pistone betrayed the personal trust of men who had befriended him, but those men were criminals who had themselves betrayed society's trust through their crimes. Who betrayed whom? And does the answer matter? These questions echo beyond just this one case. They touch on basic issues of justice, loyalty, ethics, and the price we are willing to pay for law and order. Every undercover operation, every prosecution of organized crime, every enforcement of the law against people who have created their own alternative moral systems, all of these raise similar questions. Sonny Black's story is one of contradictions, a killer who showed mercy, a criminal who inspired loyalty, a mobster who faced death with courage. In the end, Joe Pistone would say, "My intention was to put people in jail, not get them killed," and that he was sorry for Napolitano's murder. But in the brutal world of organized crime, there are no happy endings. Sonny Black knew the rules. He played the game, and when his time came, he walked into that basement, knowing exactly what waited for him. He died as he lived on his own terms. With honor intact, Sonny Black's legacy lives on. Not just in FBI history books, but in the lesson that even in the darkest corners of society, human connection goes beyond everything, even at the end. He held no anger against the man who brought him down. Perhaps that is the final honor. If this story kept you interested for the last few hours, show some love by hitting that like button. We have hundreds more incredible true crime and gangster stories waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Drop a comment below telling me what mob story you want to hear next. Should we look into the Gambino family, the Chicago outfit? Or maybe you want to hear about the Colombo Wars? And if you made it this far, you are a true crime legend. Share this video with someone who loves Mafia history. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, the streets always collect their debts. This has been the story of Sonny Black, the mobster who died with honor.